Let's begin with the mistake almost everyone makes when they encounter an avoidant personality. The instinct is to move closer. When someone becomes distant, our natural response is to pursue them. We call more. We text more. We ask for reassurance. We try to fix the silence with attention, emotion, and urgency. And while this response may feel logical, especially if you care deeply about the person, it is precisely the reaction that pushes an avoidant further away. Avoidant individuals operate with a very different internal wiring when it comes to intimacy. For them, closeness can feel overwhelming, not comforting. Their nervous system is highly sensitive to pressure, expectation, and emotional intensity. So when they sense that someone is leaning toward them too strongly, their instinct is not to move closer. Their instinct is to create space. And here's the paradox that confuses so many people. The more you chase, the colder they become. From the outside, it looks like indifference. It looks like they don't care. But in many cases, what you're actually witnessing is a protective response. The avoidant mind equates pressure with the loss of autonomy. When someone demands emotional closeness, their brain interprets that as a threat to independence. So their system activates a defense mechanism designed to restore distance. Think of it like this. Imagine someone standing very close to you in a room. If they keep stepping closer and closer, eventually your instinct is to step back. Not because you dislike them, but because you need space to breathe. Avoidants experience emotional pursuit in a very similar way. When someone moves toward them too intensely, their internal reaction is to retreat. This is why the first and most important attachment switch begins with restraint. When you stop chasing, something subtle but powerful happens. The emotional pressure disappears. The environment shifts from one of demand to one of freedom. And when that pressure is removed, the avoidant nervous system can finally relax. Now, this doesn't mean playing manipulative games. It doesn't mean punishing someone with silence or pretending you don't care. What it means is redirecting your energy back toward your own life. Instead of trying to pull someone toward you, you allow them the space to approach on their own terms. And that shift changes the psychological dynamic completely. Because once the pursuit stops, the avoidant mind no longer feels cornered. Instead of reacting defensively, they begin observing. They start noticing the absence of the pressure they had grown accustomed to. And with that absence comes something unexpected: curiosity. Human beings are naturally drawn to what feels voluntary rather than forced. When someone is no longer chasing them, avoidants often begin asking quiet questions in their own mind. Why did the pressure disappear? What changed? Where did that emotional energy go? And that curiosity is the beginning of reconnection. You see, attraction thrives in an environment where people feel free rather than obligated. When someone senses that your happiness, identity, and purpose do not depend entirely on their attention, they start seeing you differently. You stop appearing like a source of pressure and start appearing like a source of stability. And stability is incredibly attractive to someone who fears emotional overwhelm. So the real power here is not in pursuit, it's in composure. It's in demonstrating that your life remains full, meaningful, and grounded, whether someone moves closer or not. That kind of presence signals emotional strength, and strength creates respect. In the end, the moment you stop chasing is often the moment the avoidant finally has the space to turn around. Because the truth is simple and profound. When pressure disappears, possibility begins. Once the pressure disappears and you stop chasing, something interesting begins to happen in the psychology of an avoidant person. The dynamic shifts from pursuit to curiosity. And curiosity is one of the most powerful emotional forces in human behavior. You see, attraction is not fueled by constant availability. In many cases, it's fueled by a certain level of mystery. Not the kind of mystery that comes from manipulation or emotional games, but the kind that comes from a person who is fully engaged in their own life. Someone who is centered, purposeful, and not revolving their entire world around another person. Avoidants in particular are deeply responsive to this dynamic. When someone is always present, always reaching out, always explaining their feelings, the avoidant mind becomes accustomed to that emotional accessibility. It becomes predictable. And once something becomes completely predictable, the brain stops paying close attention to it. There is no psychological tension, no sense of discovery. But the moment that predictability shifts, the brain wakes up. Think about how human attention works. We notice change more than we notice consistency. When something that was once constant becomes slightly less available, our awareness sharpens. We start asking questions. We start observing more closely. This is exactly what happens when someone who once pursued an avoidant begins focusing on their own growth, their own passions, their own direction in life. Suddenly, the avoidant senses a different energy. You're no longer trying to convince them to stay. You're no longer orbiting around their reactions or moods. Your life has momentum, movement, purpose. And paradoxically, that independence creates a powerful form of attraction because independence signals emotional security. Avoidants are often drawn to people who appear grounded within themselves, people who don't seem desperate for validation, people who have their own center of gravity. When they encounter someone like that, it disrupts the assumptions they may have built about relationships. Instead of feeling trapped, they feel intrigued. Now, it's important to understand something here. Mystery doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It doesn't mean shutting down emotionally. It simply means allowing space for the other person's imagination to re-engage. When every thought, feeling, and intention is constantly explained, there's nothing left for the mind to explore. But when someone is quietly confident, when they share themselves without overextending, when they live a life that is rich beyond the relationship, something very powerful happens. The avoidant begins leaning forward. They start wondering what you're doing. They notice that you're not reacting the way you used to. They sense that your attention is invested in meaningful things beyond them. And this activates a natural human instinct, the instinct to move toward what feels valuable and self-sufficient. Philosophically speaking, human beings respect what stands on its own. When someone appears emotionally dependent, the relationship begins to feel like an obligation. But when someone stands confidently in their own identity, their presence begins to feel like a choice. And choice is where real attraction lives. For an avoidant person, this is incredibly important. Their deepest fear is losing their autonomy inside a relationship. But when they see that you are fully capable of existing, thriving, and growing without clinging to them, their fear begins to soften. They start recognizing that closeness with you may not threaten their independence after all. And in that moment, the dynamic flips. The person who once seemed distant begins showing signs of curiosity. They check in. They initiate contact. They begin stepping closer, not because they were pulled, but because they were drawn. This is the quiet power of mystery combined with self-possession. When your life becomes something meaningful on its own, you stop chasing attention. And strangely enough, that's often the moment attention begins chasing you, because in the end, the most magnetic people in the world are not the ones trying to be noticed. They are the ones deeply engaged in living. Now, once curiosity begins to reappear and the avoidant starts leaning back into the connection, the next phase becomes absolutely critical, because attraction alone does not create devotion. What transforms distance into genuine emotional investment is something much deeper, emotional safety. And this is where many people misunderstand avoidant behavior. They assume avoidants resist closeness because they simply don't care enough, or because they're incapable of deep connection. But when you study the psychology beneath their behavior, a different picture emerges. Most avoidants are not rejecting intimacy itself. What they're rejecting is the emotional overwhelm they associate with it. For many of them, closeness in early life was unpredictable. It may have come with criticism, pressure, emotional volatility, or expectations they felt they could never fully meet. So over time, the mind learned a simple survival strategy. Distance equals safety. If intimacy feels like losing control, the brain will naturally try to avoid it. That's why emotional safety becomes the real turning point in this dynamic. Because when someone interacts with an avoidant in a way that feels calm, steady, and respectful of boundaries, something remarkable begins to happen. Their nervous system stops preparing for conflict. Instead of anticipating pressure, they begin experiencing stability. Now think about how rare that experience can be for someone with avoidant tendencies. They are used to people reacting strongly when they withdraw. They expect frustration, emotional demands, or attempts to force conversations before they feel ready. And every time that happens, it reinforces their belief that closeness leads to stress. But when someone responds differently, when they remain grounded, patient, and emotionally balanced, it disrupts that expectation. The avoidant starts realizing that being around you does not come with emotional chaos. And that realization is incredibly powerful because devotion is not created through intensity. It is created through consistency, through repeated experiences that prove the relationship is a place where both people can breathe. When you communicate without accusation, when you express needs without pressure, when you allow space without withdrawing love, you create an emotional environment that feels safe to step into. And the avoidant mind notices this more than you might realize. You see, trust for an avoidant person builds quietly. They may not immediately verbalize it. They may not suddenly transform into the most expressive partner overnight. But internally, they are observing something important. You are not triggering their defenses. Instead, your presence feels steady. Philosophically speaking, every human relationship is shaped by the nervous system. Before logic, before words, before conscious decisions, the body is constantly asking a simple question: am I safe here? When the answer becomes yes, the entire emotional landscape changes. Walls that once felt necessary begin to soften. Guarded conversations become more open. Moments of vulnerability start appearing in small, almost subtle ways. And if that safety continues consistently, the avoidant begins allowing themselves to invest more deeply, not because they were forced to, but because the relationship finally feels like a place where they don't have to defend themselves. And when someone who has spent years protecting their independence discovers a connection that doesn't threaten it, something shifts inside them. They begin realizing that closeness and freedom may not be opposites after all. They can coexist. And once that realization takes root, devotion no longer feels like a risk. It begins to feel like a natural extension of trust. So as the dynamic continues evolving, remember this: attraction may open the door, curiosity may bring someone closer, but emotional safety is what invites them to stay. Because at the deepest level, the human heart does not commit to intensity, it commits to peace. Once emotional safety begins to take root, another powerful dynamic starts shaping the relationship, and this one is often overlooked. It's the power of non-reactive confidence. Most people believe relationships are strengthened through emotional intensity, big reactions, passionate responses, dramatic conversations that prove how much someone cares. But when you're dealing with avoidant personalities, that kind of emotional volatility often has the opposite effect. Instead of creating closeness, it activates their instinct to retreat. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional escalation. When tension rises, when voices sharpen, when reactions become unpredictable, their internal system reads it as a signal that the environment is becoming unsafe. And the moment that signal appears, their protective instinct switches on again. Distance becomes their solution. Now here's where the psychology becomes interesting. Avoidants often expect emotional reactions. They've experienced them many times before. When they pull back, they anticipate frustration, anxiety, or confrontation from the other person. In many ways, they've learned to predict that pattern. So when someone responds differently, when someone remains calm, composed, and steady, it interrupts the script they were expecting. And that interruption carries a powerful message. Non-reactive confidence doesn't mean you suppress your feelings or pretend things don't affect you. It means you respond from a place of emotional stability rather than emotional urgency. You communicate clearly but without panic. You express your perspective but without trying to force immediate resolution. In other words, you demonstrate that your emotional center remains intact, regardless of temporary distance. This kind of presence has a profound psychological impact because confidence, especially calm confidence, signals self-sufficiency. It shows that your sense of identity is not dependent on controlling the other person's behavior. And when an avoidant encounters that kind of emotional strength, something shifts internally. Instead of feeling responsible for managing your emotions, they begin feeling safe enough to explore their own. Think about the deeper philosophy behind this. Human beings naturally respect individuals who remain grounded under pressure. When someone stays composed in uncertain situations, it communicates resilience. It suggests inner stability, and stability creates trust. Avoidants are especially responsive to this because their greatest fear inside relationships is emotional chaos. If they sense that closeness will lead to unpredictable reactions, they instinctively protect themselves by staying distant. But when they observe someone who can handle emotional fluctuations without collapsing into anxiety or anger, their perception changes. They begin seeing the relationship as stable rather than overwhelming. And with that perception comes a subtle but important shift in respect. Respect, after all, is one of the foundations of deep attraction. It grows when someone demonstrates emotional maturity, patience, and self-control, not in a rigid or cold way, but in a way that shows they understand themselves. Non-reactive confidence communicates something very simple yet very powerful. I value this connection, but I also value my own stability. And that balance is incredibly compelling because it removes the sense of emotional pressure while still keeping the door open for connection. Over time, this steadiness creates a new relational pattern. The avoidant no longer feels like they must constantly defend their independence. They begin realizing that the relationship can withstand space, uncertainty, and emotional complexity without falling apart. And that realization allows them to step closer without fear. You see, real confidence in relationships is not about dominance or control. It's about emotional balance. It's about the quiet strength of someone who can remain centered even when the dynamics shift. And when an avoidant encounters that level of steadiness, something inside them begins to relax. Because for the first time, closeness doesn't look like chaos. It looks like stability. And stability is the kind of strength that quietly pulls people closer. As emotional stability becomes the foundation of the connection, another subtle but powerful mechanism begins to emerge. And this one often surprises people. It's the role that absence plays in awakening emotional awareness. Most individuals assume that closeness alone strengthens attachment. We're taught that constant presence, constant reassurance, and constant availability are the signals of commitment. But psychologically speaking, the human mind doesn't always recognize value when something is endlessly accessible. It recognizes value when contrast appears. This is especially true for avoidant personalities. When someone is always there, always reaching out, always initiating, always emotionally present, the avoidant mind can unconsciously take that presence for granted. Not out of malice or indifference, but simply because the relationship becomes part of the background of their life. And when something becomes part of the background, it requires very little conscious attention. But the moment that constant accessibility shifts, something changes inside the mind. Space appears. And space has an interesting effect on human perception. It creates room for reflection. It allows the brain to process experiences that were previously ignored. It invites the emotional system to notice what is no longer immediately available. Think about how memory works. We often don't fully appreciate certain experiences while they are happening. But when those experiences are no longer present, the mind begins replaying them. It reviews conversations, shared moments, emotional connections that once felt ordinary. This reflective process becomes particularly powerful for avoidants because many of them suppress emotional awareness while the relationship feels intense or immediate. When closeness is constant, their protective instinct focuses on maintaining distance rather than exploring their feelings. But when the environment becomes quieter, their mind finally has space to examine what the connection actually meant. In that space, the absence of someone steady and emotionally grounded becomes noticeable. They begin recognizing the calm conversations, the sense of understanding, the presence that didn't create pressure. They remember the stability that once surrounded the relationship. And gradually, something shifts inside their perception. The connection that once felt overwhelming begins to feel valuable. This is why scarcity, when it happens naturally, not artificially, can awaken emotions that were previously hidden. It interrupts routine. It brings attention back to the relationship. Philosophically speaking, human beings often discover the importance of something through contrast. When a meaningful presence disappears, even temporarily, the mind is forced to confront the possibility of losing it entirely. And that possibility triggers awareness. Now, this doesn't mean withdrawing as a strategy or trying to provoke fear. That approach quickly becomes manipulative and unstable. What it truly means is allowing your life to expand beyond the relationship, continuing your growth, your ambitions, your friendships, your purpose. In other words, you stop structuring your entire emotional world around the avoidant person. And ironically, that independence creates the very distance necessary for them to begin recognizing the depth of the connection. When they no longer feel the constant emotional presence, they start asking quiet questions within themselves. They wonder what you're doing, how your life is unfolding, whether the connection they once had with you is still possible. Curiosity becomes reflection. Reflection becomes emotional awareness. And emotional awareness is often the moment when avoidants begin missing someone in a way they didn't fully understand before. This process cannot be forced. It can only occur when space allows the mind to breathe and process. But when it does happen, the emotional landscape begins to shift dramatically. The person who once felt distant starts realizing that the connection was not a burden. It was a rare form of stability. And once that realization settles in, the relationship is no longer something they feel they must escape. It becomes something they may want to return to, because sometimes the clearest way for the heart to recognize value is through the quiet echo of absence. And in that silence, emotions that were once hidden finally begin to speak. And this brings us to the final shift in the entire dynamic, the moment where curiosity, safety, stability, and reflection begin to converge into something deeper. Because at the core of avoidant behavior lies a single fear that quietly shapes all the others, the fear of losing freedom. For someone with avoidant tendencies, relationships have often felt like environments where autonomy slowly disappears. Closeness, in their past experiences, may have meant expectations, emotional demands, or the subtle pressure to constantly prove their commitment. Over time, the mind learns to associate intimacy with confinement. So even when an avoidant genuinely cares about someone, a part of their internal system remains alert. It's constantly scanning for signs that the relationship might eventually limit their independence. And this is where the real transformation happens. The moment an avoidant realizes that a relationship can contain both connection and freedom, something fundamental begins to change inside them. Because the dynamic they once feared starts to look very different. Throughout everything we've talked about, removing pressure, creating curiosity, building emotional safety, demonstrating calm confidence, and allowing space, you've been communicating a deeper message without necessarily saying it out loud. You've been showing that closeness with you does not come at the cost of individuality. You have your own life, your own direction, your own sense of purpose. Your identity is not built around controlling the relationship or defining yourself through the other person's attention. And that independence quietly dissolves the avoidant's greatest fear. For the first time, they begin to see a relationship not as a cage, but as a shared space. Philosophically speaking, the healthiest relationships are never built on possession. They're built on voluntary connection. Two individuals choosing to stand beside each other, not because they must, but because they want to. And when an avoidant senses that kind of freedom inside a connection, it allows their guard to drop in ways that surprise even them. Because devotion, contrary to popular belief, is not the result of pressure or persuasion. It grows naturally when someone feels respected, understood, and free to remain themselves. Think about it from a deeper psychological perspective. Every human being carries two powerful desires, the desire for connection and the desire for autonomy. When relationships force us to sacrifice one for the other, tension appears. But when both needs are honored at the same time, the experience becomes incredibly fulfilling. For avoidants, this balance is everything. When they realize they can be close to someone without losing their independence, the relationship stops feeling like something they need to escape. Instead, it becomes something they can safely invest in. That's when their emotional engagement begins to deepen in a way that often surprises the people around them. The person who once seemed distant may start initiating conversations. They may begin sharing more about their inner world. They may express loyalty and commitment in ways that were previously hidden behind their defenses. And what's fascinating is that this devotion rarely arrives with dramatic declarations. It often appears quietly. It shows up through consistent presence, through subtle acts of care, through the gradual opening of someone who once protected themselves from closeness. Because when the fear of losing freedom disappears, the avoidant mind no longer needs to keep one foot out the door. Instead, it can finally stand fully inside the relationship. And when that happens, the transformation is profound. The distance that once defined the connection begins to dissolve, replaced by a steady form of loyalty that grows stronger over time. Not because it was forced, but because it was chosen. And that is the real attachment switch. The moment someone realizes they can be deeply connected to another person without ever losing themselves. Because the strongest relationships are not the ones that demand devotion. They are the ones that inspire it. As we step back and look at the entire journey we've explored today, a powerful pattern begins to emerge. What changes an avoidant person is not pressure, persuasion, or emotional intensity. It's the quiet transformation of the relationship dynamic itself. At the beginning, the instinct was to chase, to move closer when they pulled away. But we discovered that pursuit only strengthens their defenses. The first shift came when the pressure disappeared, when the chase stopped, and space replaced urgency. That moment alone changes the emotional environment. Then curiosity enters the picture. When someone stops revolving their life around the avoidant and begins standing firmly within their own purpose, something fascinating happens. Attention returns, not because it was demanded, but because independence creates intrigue. From there, the foundation deepens through emotional safety. Avoidants don't open up because someone pushes harder. They open up because they begin to feel that closeness will not overwhelm them. Calm communication, patience, and consistency slowly replace the expectation of conflict. Then comes emotional steadiness, the power of non-reactive confidence. When someone remains grounded rather than reactive, they demonstrate strength that avoidants deeply respect. Instead of feeling responsible for managing emotional chaos, they begin to experience the relationship as stable and secure. And when space naturally appears, something even more profound begins. The absence of constant availability creates reflection. It gives the avoidant mind the quiet it needs to recognize the value of what was once present. Feelings that were buried beneath defense mechanisms finally have room to surface. But the final transformation, the real attachment switch, happens when the avoidant realizes something they may have never experienced before. They realize that closeness with you does not require the loss of their freedom. Connection and independence can exist together, and that realization dissolves the deepest fear that has always lived beneath their distance. You see, devotion cannot be forced. It cannot be negotiated through arguments or emotional pressure. Devotion grows when someone feels safe enough to choose the relationship freely, without feeling controlled or consumed by it. When an avoidant person discovers that kind of connection, something remarkable happens. The walls that once protected them begin to feel unnecessary. The distance that once defined them begins to shrink. And slowly, the person who seemed emotionally unreachable begins to invest in ways that are steady, loyal, and deeply genuine. Not because they were convinced, but because they were understood. In the end, the goal was never to make someone love you. The real shift was becoming someone whose presence feels calm, free, and emotionally secure. Someone who doesn't chase, doesn't collapse under distance, and doesn't try to control the rhythm of connection. Because when you embody that kind of strength, something extraordinary happens. The very person who once seemed ice cold begins to move closer on their own. And the greatest paradox of all is this: the moment you stop trying to force devotion is often the moment devotion finally appears.